PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. We have liftoff in the candidates tournament. So we're into round 2 and things have just exploded. If you remember, round 1, 4 draws. Intriguing games, I have to say, very interesting games. But we're yet to have a decisive result. In round 2, well, I'm recording this just a little bit before the end of the round, but already we've got 3 decisive results. This is pretty incredible. And this game is one of them. So I'd like to look at the game between Hikaru Nakamura and Vidit Gujrathi. Well, for many people, Hikaru is one of the favourites in the tournament. And he's playing here Vidit, very strong player who won the FIDE Grand Swiss tournament to qualify for the candidates. That was in the autumn. And, well, in fact, Vidit was first and Nakamura was second. But, you know, Nakamura playing with white here, I think would want to try and target Vidit because, you know, Vidit is not, you know, one of the top players. And, yeah, Nakamura playing white, well, you know, he should try and go for a win here. So he's played the classical Spanish and Knight f6 from Vidit, the good old Berlin variation. And that suits his style. Vidit is a classical player, very solid, very correct player. And that fits with the Berlin. And here Hikaru plays d3, so he keeps the tension. So just protecting that e-pawn. Of course, there's the old line, the Berlin endgame, which arises from these moves. Of course, that's a very well-trodden variation. But d3 just keeps more tension in the position. Obviously, there are no exchanges. And yeah, I would anticipate that from Nakamura. Bishop c5, that's the typical move. Why not bring the bishop out to an active square? And c3. And black castles and white castles. So all very regular so far. And Nakamura plays, after 5 minutes thought, he goes for h3, which can be a useful move because often you want to play rook e1 and perhaps play with d4, and you want to rule out bishop g4, for example, or sometimes rule out knight g4. It's very, instead of h3, you might remember that in the autumn I was looking at a lot of games where white pinned with bishop g5, and with that bishop outside the pawn chain, that would really sharpen the position. But interesting that Nakamura doesn't go in for that. He wants to play something steadier. Knight e7 from Vidit. So this is very typical in this variation and in Spanish and in the Gioco Piano. The knight swings round to g6, where it still supports the e-pawn, but also looks at the f4 square. So it's actually quite an aggressive way to play. d4. And of course you can just drop the bishop back. In fact, Vidit plays a novelty, c6, so it's a little bit unusual. Well, it's not been seen in this exact position before. Of course, it's a typical move. And it's actually an invitation for white to win a pawn. Now, Hikaru simply dropped the bishop back, but he could have taken this and then taken here. I can understand why he didn't want to do this, because I think black can round up this pawn quite easily, so the bishop will come to a nice square on e6 and the rook will come out, rook here. I think in order to hold that pawn, white is going to have to play really precisely, and if obviously Vidit had prepared that well, so Nakamura decided, right, I'm just going to be prudent here and just drop the bishop back, just play a normal move. So the bishop drops back, defending the pawn, defending the e-pawn. And the bishop drops back. Well, you'll notice that there's a pawn that can be taken here. So this is the second pawn that Vidit is offering. Very interesting. And he'd played quickly up to this point. So clearly he's in his preparation. Now, if White doesn't want to go in for this pawn grab, you can just go knight d2 here. But after knight g6, it seems to me that Black is very comfortable. You know, this bishop can always drop back to c7 if it's hassled, and the knight on g6 looks good. So after quite a big think, 22 minutes, Hikaru was tempted to take that pawn. There you go, the big fish takes the bait. Let's see what happens. So pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and now a shocking move. So what's Vidit got for this pawn? Okay, over to you. Black to play. I'll have a drink, you have a think. Black to play. What did Vidit do next? Very interesting idea. Very unusual idea, actually. Okay, cheers. Time for a slurp of tea. Here we go. Are you ready? Boom! Bishop takes h3. Shocker. Well, I'm sure that Hikaru had anticipated this. Vidit certainly had. So what's the big idea? Well, if pawn takes, there's a very clever move. Queen b8. Very important the queen goes here. So if that knight retreats, watch what happens. Boom! The queen is in, and this is crushing position. Basically, Black has, yeah, well, you can see that the pin is just winning here. Black's attack is just too strong there. Okay, so what about bishop f4, holding the knight? Well, here is why the queen had to go to b8, because the bishop can drop back. And there's pressure here. Again, it's a pin. Now, this isn't bad at all for White, actually. But it's a tricky position. I mean, one thing is you don't want to allow that queen up the board. That looks quite nice for Black. And if f4, then Black's pieces are really active here. I think White's problem is that these pieces aren't in play. So Black, you know, has quite nice play on the king side. If White plays precisely, it's okay, but it's tricky. So Hikaru was minded not to go in for that. He didn't take the bishop. Instead, he thought, okay, that knight is loose. I'm going to play it back and attack the bishop. And now Vidit had quite a big think. He played bishop g4. So this f-pawn can't move because of the pin. So queen c2 from Hikaru. And again, a big think from Vidit. He spent 32 minutes, over 32 minutes, on bishop c7. Now it's certainly pointing in the right direction. But there is a tactical issue here. What happens if White pushes the e-pawn, opening this up? And Hikaru sensed this must be his moment. I mean, if White doesn't play e5, then Black's pieces are set up beautifully on the king side. You know, knight g6, maybe the knight swings over to h5 and that queen can land on h4. This is really dangerous. The lack of the h-pawn can really make itself felt. So Hikaru went for it with e5. And knight d7, knight retreated, and bishop takes h7 check. So this is extraordinary. Just looks like Hikaru's broken through. At the moment he's got an extra pawn. In fact, it's not so clear. And Vidit had judged this very finely. He, you know, invested a lot of time. That's very dangerous to do that against Nakamura. we know how he's a very practical player and often just kind of harries his opponent, but when it's short of time. But White's problem is this: it's impossible to kind of join up with the king side when the queen side pieces are still on their starting blocks. So this is a massive problem. Nakamura thought for over 20 minutes here and retreated the bishop. I mean, obviously there are issues with black potentially playing g6 to trap the bishop. My computer wants to play queen e4, which looks crazy after f5, but actually White can sack a piece. I mean, it still looks better for black, once again, because these pieces don't contribute. But it's complicated. But what's clear is that bishop d3 is not very promising for White. Let's see what happened. b5, pushing the knight back, and then knight takes e5. And you can see that Vidit has a wonderful initiative here. Material is even, but all black's pieces are in play, or they're about to come into play very quickly, and he's bringing that knight into the game, for example, with tempo. If knight takes, then knight takes puts the knight in an absolutely glorious position, and then f5, and this is really powerful for black. Nakamura played bishop e2, f5 anyway, so protecting this bishop, and well, that pawn can actually be very useful in the attack. So for example, if knight takes, pawn takes, and this sets up threats with knight f3, and black just has a crushing position. So understandably, Nakamura played f4 after 9 minutes thought. So he's trying to block this diagonal. He's looking to push that knight away and maybe exchange some pieces. But Vidit had the perfect response to this. So what's the problem when you play a pawn move like f4? What's the problem when that pawn moves away from its starting square on f2? It's this diagonal. So this one might be blocked, but watch what happens now. Bishop b6. That is an absolute killer, because without an h-pawn, the king is not going to find security on the h-file. For example, if pawn takes knight, knight d5, so this pin is absolutely deadly. Let's see, if g3, well, takes here, queen g5. I mean, black is not playing kind of any outrageous moves here. It's just a case of bringing the pieces over into the attack. So there's just going to be a massive check on the h-file. And you can see that bishop is dominating. If that's exchanged, then the knight just takes its place. It's an absolute shocker. So pawn takes, knight d5 is just a killer. So Nakamura, after 20 minutes thought and a lot of head shaking, and he realised he was lost, he played king f2. Now that's a really tricky move, because there's potential for the rook to swing over to hassle the king. And yeah, if there's an exchange here, you never know. The queen might be able to swoop down. That's on a very good day. So how did Vidit react? Knight d5, exploiting the pin. A check. King g8. In fact, the king is pretty safe on g8. And obviously, there's threats to exchange here, and the king is woefully exposed in the middle of the board. So Nakamura took that piece, but then queen g5. You can see all the pressure is building here. It's very nasty. And then the king ran. So Vidit has the piece back. In fact, yeah, he's not even any material down. Hasn't even sacked a pawn to get to this position. And as before, Nakamura's problem is that these pieces simply don't get in the game. Queen check. King d2. Oof. That's really nasty. I mean, obviously, if the queen blocks, well, there's lots of good moves here, but let's start with that one. So king d2, rook d8 check, and now absolute killer move for black. Queen g5. And you can see that the king is just caught in the line of fire of the queen. It can't move at all. There's going to be a massive discovered check. There is no defense. If the knight blocks, then simply knight c4 is a deadly pin. I mean, this is kids' tactics, basically. If here you take with a rook and rook number 2 takes its place, and this is winning for black. So b3 played, and now the killer move from Vidit. Knight f1 check. King b2, and after knight g3, again with more head shakes, Hikaru resigned, offered its hand. So the handshake ended the game, not just the head shake. Yeah, of course it's completely winning for black, because it's possible just to take that one. So black is a rook for a knight ahead. This knight still can't get in the game because the queen or the rook will swoop down. So it is utterly lost. I mean, I think if we play a nice centralizing move like queen e3 that looks really nice, or perhaps just rook e8 in order to take that pawn, white's position is absolutely hopeless. And yeah, what a lesson. These pieces never got in the game. And if we go right back to move 9, where Hikaru took that pawn on e5, and suddenly you can see that black has all his minor pieces in play, and these guys are still on the starting blocks. Not that white's position is lost here, but it's a big red flag. And somehow Hikaru got embroiled into a middle game dogfight when his pieces on the queen side were undeveloped. They hadn't got into the game. Superb preparation from Vidit. Very clever idea that just slightly discombobulated Nakamura, who was tempted to go for that pawn, and then the position exploded. Wow. So Vidit started really well. He has 1.5 now. Now, I mentioned it looks like we're going to get 4 decisive results. I'm just going to check in on the game. So Caruana beat Abbasov fairly comfortably. He wasn't pushed too hard. Gukesh defeated Prag in an absolutely mental game. And have I missed any others? Yeah, the final game was Nepo against Firuz Jah, which I can see has just finished. And Nepo defeated Firuz Jah again. An unbelievably complicated game. So after 4 draws, we have 4 decisive results in round 2. Absolutely fantastic. So do join me for round 3. By the way, the channel is going to cover the Women's Candidates Tournament, and we have Women's International Master Svetlana Demchenko, who plays for the Canadian women's team. She will be covering the Women's Candidates Tournament, so watch out for her videos. I'm looking forward to seeing them as well. So there we go. You're going to get bonus coverage on the PowerPlayChess channel. See you for round 3.